evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And as you know, if you're a regular viewer of this show, we spend a lot of time talking about the news and current events. Tonight we'll be talking about the news and some current events, but from a slightly different perspective, from the perspective of fiction. Our guest tonight is author Eric Wentz, the author of Killer Sharks, De Profundis. Eric, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's talk very briefly, since I introduced it as current events and the news. Give us the 30-second synopsis of the book. It's a kind of a thriller of sorts.
It has been classified by some of those people that have read it and reviewed it as a military fiction / thriller. And if I could summarize it as succinctly as possible, it would be this. Yes, it's a book that deals with terrorism, but it's also a book that deals with the concept of honor and most particularly the concept of knighthood in the contemporary world. And if you will, the clash between those two elements.
I thought honor and knighthood didn't clash. I thought the one went with the other. Aren't they complementary?
Well, the clash is not with the concept of honor and so forth with itself, but with those that oppose it and that would denigrate that aspect of culture.
Okay. Well, let's go way back to the beginning. Let's talk a little about you as an author. This is your second book now.
Correct.
But it's a second book concerning where the main character is Grant Chisholm, your hero, and I understand you may be bringing him back in future works as well, right?
Right. And a lot of his experiences are based upon my own experiences in the military. And I should tell you that part of what prompted me to write and, in effect, create this character is that I come from a military family. My father spent his entire adult career as a U.S. Marine and a sailor in the United States Navy. My uncle was one of the most highly decorated Marines of World War II, a man who was nominated for Congressional Medal of Honor, among other things. So what I've done is I've pieced together parts and elements of their career and my own, and I put them in a contemporary setting.
And your children are also in the armed forces?
Yes, right? I have two children that are grown up, and both of them are officers in the United States Army, and they've both spent considerable time in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth.
And you yourself, in part of your experience in the Navy, you have been in Guantanamo, correct? And
right.
You have worked as an interrogator there, right?
Yes.
So you have some firsthand experience about the things that come up in this book.
Well, that's part of the reason I wrote the book, or both of these books, in fact. Over the years, I had read a lot of Tom Clancy, Clive Cussler, Vince Flynn, and as I was reading them, oftentimes I would find myself being very critical. I'd say, that's not the way it works. And I actually thought that in writing this type of work, what some call the action thriller, I had an advantage. I could write from experience, and I wouldn't have to go look up things in an encyclopedia, or I wouldn't have to go out and interview people to figure out how does it actually work? How does this system in the Navy work in regard to the gathering of information, whether it's on computers or what have you. So I thought that I actually had the wealth of experience. And the other thing is I taught English literature for a number of years. And as you know, I have a master's degree in linguistics from Ohio State and a couple of other master's degrees, all of which I tried to use in terms of exploiting my background in history, literature, linguistics, and the hard realities of two Gulf Wars.
So the purpose of writing a book like this, obviously the first one is to entertain people, right? Why write a work of fiction unless it's something that people are going to want to read? And being a thriller, it's part of the fast pace, and how does it turn out, and what happens next? But what prompted you to write particularly about Guantanamo? I think that's an interesting choice of setting.
Well, first of all, it's in the news frequently enough, and people do want to know about it. But I also had another reason. And the reason had to do with the fact that oftentimes, as a member of the United States Armed Services, we would find stories in the evening news and we'd watch something and go, that's not true, that's not the way that happened, or you've got the characters mixed up. And sometimes we would find stories that were fabrications that would appear on the news, but we were never allowed to respond. And in all candor, the Bush administration, I thought, was particularly adverse to responding publicly to what oftentimes were not just slights, but what I thought were instances of the deliberate disinformation or misinformation regarding Guantanamo. But again, we weren't allowed to respond. And so even for this book, I had to get permission from the Navy in order to publish it. And at a certain point...
Now, let me stop you there for a second, because you've been retired from the Navy for some time, right?
2 years.
So why would it matter? I mean, it's a work of fiction, and you're no longer part of the Navy. Why would you need to get clearance to write about that?
The reservations placed upon anybody in the military who's had a certain level of clearance are such that for the rest of your life, anything you publish has to be vetted by them. Because even fiction can inadvertently reveal things that are classified.
Okay.
And so, yes, my story is fiction, but let me answer that question of fiction or not fiction in response to a question that someone else asked me. He said, is your book fact or is it fiction? And I said, yes. It's both. Obviously, I can't use the real names of certain people, but a number of the characters in the book are real people. The difference is I've massaged the material in such a way as that I would hope you would say, well, that could be so-and-so, but it could be somebody else. And if you're the person that was at Guantanamo at this particular moment, or you're the person involved in the scenes in Cyprus, you might say, that could be, but I don't want to put myself in a situation where I'm embarrassing somebody, and I certainly would never do anything to reveal anything that's classified.
And in fact, all authors ultimately draw from reality. So even in books that are set in fantastical settings, the characters really are drawn from people whom the author knows. I mean, that's where you get the experience of people and what the kind of characters are and how people think and how people operate. So in some sense, no matter what the fiction, the characters are based on real people to a certain extent, correct?
I think they are, but let me, there's a caveat that I would throw in here. Oftentimes when you see a movie, it'll say, this is based upon a true story. The moment I see...
I'm always wary of that.
Yeah, the moment
Based
I
on?
see that based
Right.
upon, I go, okay. In other words, because World War II happens to have been a real event, the rest of this is supposedly true.
Yeah.
I would like to think that my books have that element to them, such that I can say, yes, it's based upon real episodes. But at the same time, the characterization is much more real than it is fiction. In so many words, these are people that I know.
But the sequence of events, for example, could be entirely fictional or could be composed of different events that happened in different contexts.
And some of it is theoretical, hypothetical. In other words, if this were to happen, then this could happen. And in so many words, I would suggest to you that has long been the appeal of Tom Clancy. Clancy extrapolates.
Yes.
If you did this, then is it not probable that the Soviet Union would respond in this way? And if you did this, isn't it not probable that the U.S. would respond in this way? You say, well, that never happened. Yes, but it's that kind of extrapolation that always draws the attention of intelligence officers, because they're always dealing with the hypothetical to a degree. What might happen is just as important as what has happened, because you have to prepare for those eventualities. And a lot of works of fiction actually help the intelligence community deal with likely scenarios.
In fact, there's a movie with Robert Redford.
Yes.
3 Days of the Condor.
Right.
Based on that very concept that the intelligence
And he's the
agencies-
reader.
He's the reader, yes. He reads everything.
Well, if I can offer a more contemporary example of that, just think what happened after 9/11, and think who was invited to the White House. A number of Hollywood producers, a number of people that created cyber games and so forth. The whole idea was to ask them, what would you do if you were the enemy, and how would you attack us? And in effect, the CIA also has what are called the red cells. And these cells are to act as the enemy. And even in war game scenarios that the U.S. military typically engages in, the purpose of a war game is not necessarily just to beat the Americans who are actually on your side as part of your training, but it is to act in a way that is consistent with the doctrine, the military doctrine of that country, and to see if that doctrine can defeat the Americans. In other words, you're not going to use American doctrine, military doctrine, against your own team. You're going to use the doctrine of a Saddam Hussein or someone else.
Or the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Right.
And you probably know this, one of the most interesting ironies of people who read everything is that the original war plan of the Japanese in the Pacific was written by Franklin D. Roosevelt as Secretary of the Navy. And he thought, well, if I were an Eastern power, how would I attack the United States? So he wrote this, and of course, all the Japanese Admiralty, they sent all of their officers over. They read the book. Sure enough, when they attacked, that was the plan they were following. So it's a great irony, I think, of history that when you say you read everything, you try to figure out what other people are thinking. Here was FDR himself thinking about how would I attack my own country, and in fact created the plan for the people who attacked.
Mm-hmm. Well, Admiral Yamamoto was also educated at Harvard. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. And Yamamoto, of course, was the person that spoke out most vehemently against the attack of the Americans because he thought the Japanese were underestimating the resourcefulness of the Americans, and ultimately...
He was correct.
Yes.
Yeah, I think even the Germans underestimated the manufacturing capacity of the United States, which ultimately I think played such a huge role. The fact that we were able to turn out so much material and raise armies so quickly was something that none of the Axis powers or the Japanese powers had anticipated. But anyway, coming back from World War II history to more contemporary history.
Okay.
So one of the things I struck, and we talked about this a little bit in the green room, the characters in a thriller. There's good guys and there's bad guys. You know, and the good guys are generally really good, and the bad guys are really bad. And I know that in that genre, that's how the stories work. You know, the good guys are good and the bad guys are bad. In actuality, though, nobody's really all good and nobody's really all bad. So when you draw these characters, how do you balance that when you're thinking about these guys? And having read almost all of this book so far, the good guys seem really good. But good guys have flaws. Good guys do bad things. Bad guys have some good qualities. Bad guys sometimes do good things. But in the genre, does it allow that? Or in a thriller like this, do you have to make the good guys really good and the bad guys really bad?
Well, I think by virtue of the fact that I'm writing largely for an American audience, there's a propensity on the part of me as an author to illustrate my own beliefs and so forth, and recognize the fact that it's going to be much more appealing to an American audience than, say, an audience in Saudi Arabia or Libya. Okay? But at the same time, in response to directly to your question, the genre per se does not require that you have all good guys and all bad guys. I would suggest if you're looking for that kind of villainy, actually you find it in the Clive Cussler novels, where the characters are more caricatures than they are real people. I would like to think, and I'm going to use an illustration without spoiling the book, a lot of people have told me that they found the most appealing character in the book. They said they like Chisholm, but they really like Sanchez, because they told me Sanchez is real. And
Sanchez is a Cuban, by the way,
he's
without revealing that too much of the
But at the
plot.
same time, he reflects the conflict of a man who comes from a communist regime who's not entirely enthralled by that.
Right.
Not sold on that. And Chisholm, if you will, represents in some ways, as you say, that strong character. He's not particularly talkative. He can occasionally be humorous. But at the same time, he also represents those ideals, and I alluded to this at the very beginning, the ideal of knighthood. And you'd say, what in the world does that have to do with anything?
Yeah, and how is he a knight?
First of all, the whole recruiting mechanism of the United States military, especially the Marine Corps.
I've seen
the
TV
concept
commercials.
of knighthood is deeply embedded, because you're going to lose control of those men on a battlefield. You cannot directly control them unless there's something internally that they've absorbed. And I would suggest that goes all the way back to the very, almost the very beginning of our nation, and even beyond that. But let me give you an illustration from my own life that I think indicates how important this is. I have a son that came back from his second tour of Iraq not too long ago, and he's part of the 7th Cavalry. And the 7th Cavalry is one of the more renowned outfits of the United States military. Most people know it, however, for Custer's Last Stand. Okay? But they're still around today. They led the charge into Baghdad in 2003. My son came back. He arrived at Fort Riley, Kansas, along with several hundred other members of the 7th Cavalry. And his commanding officer told him, next week we're going to have a welcoming ceremony. It's a dinner and a dance, which means you'll wear your traditional cavalry attire, the broad-rimmed hats. You're going to wear boots, and you wear spurs.
And how about a sword? Do they still carry one of those?
Well, they still use them, but not everybody's expected to have a sword in that case. But you do wear the 1870s attire, okay?
Interesting.
And that's done on ceremonial occasions. And my son was told the keynote speaker will be a man by the name of Colonel Crandall. And Colonel Crandall is depicted in the movie We Were Soldiers Once and Young, if you've ever seen that film with Mel Gibson. It's a true story, not based upon a true story. It is a true story. The consultants were the men that were actually in the battle. And Colonel Crandall eventually got the Congressional Medal of Honor for his conduct, most particularly in the Battle of the Etrang Valley. And Colonel Crandall was to be the keynote speaker, and my son was told, go to the airport, pick him up, and spend the day with him and take him anywhere he wants to go because you're going to introduce him. So my son said, I learned everything I could about him. I picked him up at the airport, drove him all around the base so that he could see his old stomping grounds. That evening, when it was his turn to introduce the keynote speaker, his commanding officer waved him down and said, go sit down, I'll take care of this. My son said, I sat there wondering, why did I take notes? What was the point of all this? He said, after Colonel Crandall was introduced, and then he spoke for about 20 minutes on valor and commitment, then he called me and said, Captain Wentz, front and center. He said, I still didn't know what was going on. He said, I saluted, and they said I was told to kneel down. Took out the sword, and they knighted him. Few people realize that on rare occasions, the United States Army still knights people.
I thought that was just in English from the UK. That's something.
Well,
that
you know, Ronald Reagan was knighted.
But in the United States, not by the Queen?
Yes, but you can be an American citizen and you can be knighted. But that's why I point this out. Even today in the United States Army, on rare occasions, we still knight people for outstanding conduct. And you say, why haven't we done away with that? This is democracy. Because the concept of knighthood, we may not always call it that, but that's part of what I would argue that the military still attempts to instill in people, because you can't monitor their behavior each and every day, and the strain of combat is such they have to have a code, an ethic. And I'll add one other thing. Take a good look at the Medal of Honor, and take a look at the cross on the Medal of Honor. It's the same cross as the Knight Templars of the Middle Ages.
So the knighthood then would be you talk about valor and honor. I try to think about opposing forces, like I go back to the Cold War and the Soviets, for example. Now, I'm not sure there was much of a knighthood tradition in the Soviet Union, but nonetheless, wouldn't they take a similar approach? Wouldn't they have taught their soldiers, look, we can't control what's going to happen once you hit the battlefield. You're going to have to be autonomous, you're going to have to know what you need to do, and you're going to have to work the right way. Is that unique to the U.S. military? It would seem to me that that would be something that all militaries would try to instill in their troops.
I think that all militaries do, to a degree. Some are more successful than others, and you use the example of the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union may not have had knighthood, if you will, per se, guiding their troops on the battlefield, but they certainly had a military doctrine to which those troops were subject. And at times that military doctrine was, and I'll give you an example, Marshal Zhukov, who's the hero of the Soviet Union in World War II. If you ever read Zhukov's teachings, he talks about a code of honor and the fact that he says you have to care more about your men than yourself. And I would suggest that part of the reason he was able to inspire his men, despite the debacle that it looked like Stalingrad was going to be, and a number of other episodes, he did things that other officers, lower ranking, would not do for the enlisted men. And in some ways he cared more about the men than others higher up. And I think that that's part of what goes hand in hand with this code of honor. So he may not have called it a code of knighthood, but I'm sure he was intimately aware of these aspects of military decorum and protocol that have been successful throughout history.
So if we take that example of knighthood, could we apply that to the jihadists, who in fact feel morally compelled to do what they do and feel, if I understand correctly, feel that they are doing literally God's work and that they hold themselves to an extremely high moral code. In fact, even in some of the characters in your book, these guys hold themselves to a very strict standard. So is the concept of knighthood, can we apply that even to the other side, even in this case, where the jihadists might consider themselves these kinds of agents of virtue and honor?
Well, let me make this distinction, okay? Because I would agree that there are knights in the Islamic world and have historically been. Perhaps the best example of that in all of Islamic history is Salah ad-Din. If you recall that Salah ad-Din and Richard the Lionhearted were very much respectful of one another, and each embodied the characteristics in some ways that the other most admired. So it's not that it's anathema to the Islamic world at all. It is part of their culture, and there are numerous episodes where the Knights of the Islamic Realm acted in ways that any one of us would say, this is the kind of conduct that we want our soldiers to be able to exercise, not merely when they've been defeated, but also when they've been victorious. Now back to the jihadist. The jihadist, however, today, when they deliberately maim and cripple the innocent, the unsuspecting, and if you will, oftentimes their own, that they determine are apostate by virtue of the fact that they do not subscribe to what I would call the most severe form of Islam.
Which would be?
Well, think of bin Laden for a moment. Right. And let's just talk about simple things, where the woman per se has no rights.
Saudi Arabia is a good example.
Yeah, and so many where you look at that and you go, okay, so does that mean you have the right to kill them? Certain jihadists would say yes. And we have traditions within that element of jihad that are still problematic, I would say, even in much of the Islamic world. And unfortunately, those people, including many imams that have spoken out on this matter, have been assassinated or have been threatened. So it's not as if there is this monolithic culture that says it's always this way. But the element of jihad that we oftentimes see being preached today is not necessarily completely in concert with what historically has been part of the Islamic world. And jihad, and I'll cite Abu Bakr, one of Muhammad's early followers. Abu Bakr says that the greatest jihad is the one with yourself, that to be a morally upright person is the great struggle, okay? So obviously he had a different notion of jihad than what a bin Laden has today. And bin Laden, I would argue, part of what he envisioned was the return of the caliphate. And the argument is we have the right to take and to kill, and bin Laden said this, that he would kill 10 million Americans if that's what he had to do to make them submit to Islam.
But, and I don't dispute any of that, and I try to read the news and keep myself informed on what's happening and what has happened. But the idea of killing innocents, or actually in the current world where it's known as asymmetric warfare, where no one on the planet can go toe-to-toe with the U.S. military, and everybody knows that. Everyone understands that. Everyone accepts that. And so if you see this country as your enemy, you have limited options. You can't go toe-to-toe, so you have to do something asymmetric, in their case, terrorism. But I would argue you can view that as a rational response to a highly asymmetric situation. And it's not unique to Muslims. Look at the Oklahoma City bombings. Those were people who firmly believed in what they were doing and felt that this was a way that they could exercise asymmetric power against a monolithic force that they couldn't otherwise fight. So as we look at jihadists and we think about this, and my question is, this doesn't strike me as something that's unique to Islam. It seems to manifest itself now, particularly in Islam, but we've seen it elsewhere. We've seen it in the kamikaze pilots in Japan. We've seen it in the Oklahoma City bombings. We've seen what seems like an incredible unconcern for human life in the Soviet gulags. Stalin with his purges, Mao in China. So this is not unique to Islam. This is it seems to me part of the human condition, and we're just seeing it played out in the context now of Islam. Is there anything that you see, though, that in your experience, particularly in Guantanamo, that seems particularly associated with Islam that might be different from these other episodes I'm talking about?
Yes. Quranic certitude. I would argue that I'm one who believes that this is a generational conflict. I don't think it's going to end next week, next year, in 10 years. And part of it is, and I go to Huntington's idea of the clash of civilizations, and it's more, and I would argue it's more than merely the Quran versus the Bible or something of that nature. I would argue that part of it is cultural differences that are significant in and of themselves. Western individualism has long been the bane, if you will, of much of the rest of the world. Go back to the Soviet Union. What did they teach about America? That Americans were a bunch of selfish individuals, and individualism in the cowboy culture was part of what they were fighting. So you say, well, the collective mentality must be adverse to that in some ways. I would argue that most of North Africa, much of the Islamic world is much more collective and familial oriented than our own culture, and therefore we are viewed as a threat, not merely economically or militarily, but also culturally. And I would suggest that's part of the reason for which we're having this conflict today. And it's not just about jihad. Jihad is the most virulent manifestation of this propensity to attack the other with whom you disagree. And part of the reason is that many of the Islamists at Guantanamo believe that their own governments are corrupt and have been infiltrated, if you will, by a Western ideology. And if you remember that bin Laden was persona non grata in Saudi Arabia for a while. And at a certain point...
in fact, he was expelled from the country, wasn't he?
Yes.
Right.
And at a certain point, many of the leaders of North Africa have found themselves under attack by fellow Muslims because they were not regarded as adhering strictly enough to a morally upright code of conduct associated with their notion of jihad, which I would argue is the idea that you have a personal struggle, and if you are Muammar Gaddafi, I see you indulging in alcohol and drugs and other things with which I disagree. You're not a good Muslim. And in addition to that, I think you've been corrupted by the money, the Western influences, and just remember that many of the, and I really think this played out very, very poorly in much of the Islamic world. Many of the leaders of the Islamic world would play in the West. In other words, yes, I'm here today and I'm praying with you, and then next week I'm in London and I'm going to rent out this hotel and we're going to have a lot of fun. And I speak from experience here, just watching what would happen on a Thursday evening in Bahrain. Bahrain was much more open, much more Western in its orientation than Saudi Arabia. On Thursday night, the limousines come pouring across the causeway from Saudi Arabia to play in Bahrain, where they can play, where they can drink alcohol. And
in fact, during the first Gulf War, the Kuwaitis who had been invaded, many members of the upper class spent that war in London in the discos, in the nightlife.
You got it.
And so here were the devout, the knights off playing at night while the country was invaded. So, but duality and this kind of hypocritical behavior is not unique to the Middle East, and it's certainly not unique to any part. It's endemic to. And a half left, but I want to ask you something that actually will take much longer than we have, but I'll tell you in about 30 seconds. The thing I hear about the Israelis and Palestinians is they have competing narratives. What happened? What's history? So do you think that we can bring those narratives together? And really, we only have about 30 seconds, so I hate to put you on the spot like that. But
so you'd like me to solve the problem in the Middle East as quickly as I can?
You're here
all right.
a while.
Just remember this. If we go back to a number of the Israeli leaders, as well as the Arab leaders, they said the road to peace in the Middle East, everything goes through Jerusalem. I don't see that being resolved anytime soon. And as the U.S. withdraws, and increasingly we do seem to be withdrawing from that area, it looks to me like the Saudis, among other things, are going to look for a counterbalancing influence to the Iranians. And ironically, the Israelis and the Saudis may, for a short time at least, be on the same side.
With that, we're out of time, and I love that's a great way to end. So, Eric, thank you so much for being here. This story will continue. I hope to have you back sometime.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. We've been visiting with Eric Wentz, author. And you can see us every Saturday night on Comcast Channel 19 at 8 o'clock. And you can find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.